As the scorching sun beat down upon the dusty, worn streets of Capua, a sense of unease settled over the city like a shroud, its inhabitants whispering among themselves of the terror that lurked beyond the distant hills, a terror that would soon bring forth a maelstrom of bloodshed and devastation. And at the forefront of this terror stood the enigmatic figure of Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general whose name had become synonymous with brutality and cunning. The year was 216 BCE, and the Second Punic War had been raging for 2 years, leaving in its wake a trail of ravaged landscapes, slaughtered armies, and a Roman Republic teetering on the brink of collapse. In a small, dimly lit tavern, nestled between the bustling marketplace and the city's grand temple, a group of men gathered around a worn wooden table, their faces illuminated only by the faint, flickering light of a solitary candle. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and wine, the sounds of laughter and conversation mingling with the clinking of cups and the occasional shout from the tavern keeper. Among them was Marcus Furius, a grizzled Roman centurion, his rugged features etched with the lines of countless battles and the weight of his own mortality. His eyes, a deep, piercing brown, seemed to bore into the very soul of the men around him, as if searching for any hint of weakness or treachery. Furius was a man of unyielding conviction, his loyalty to Rome unwavering, and his hatred for the Carthaginians burning brighter with each passing day. To his right sat Lucius Emulus, a young, ambitious tribune, his eyes aglow with an unquenchable thirst for glory and recognition. Emulus was a man of privilege, born into a noble family, and his arrogance was palpable, like the stench of rotting garbage that clung to the city's streets. He viewed the war as an opportunity to prove himself, to rise through the ranks, and to bring honor to his family's name. His smile, bright and charming, belied a calculating mind, always weighing the risks and benefits of any given situation. Across from them, sipping a cup of wine, was the gruff, veteran scout, Gaius Marcellus. His face was a topographic map of scars, each one telling a story of battles fought and won, of narrow escapes and desperate struggles. Marcellus was a man of few words, preferring to let his actions speak louder than any boastful claim. His eyes, a piercing blue, seemed to hold a deep wisdom, a knowledge gained from years of living on the edge of death. "I tell you, men," Furius said, his voice low and gravelly, like the rumble of thunder on a summer's day, "Hannibal will not stop until he has claimed Rome itself. He is a force of nature, unstoppable and unrelenting." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, as if searching for any sign of doubt or weakness. "We must be prepared to face him, to stand against the fury of the Carthaginians, and to emerge victorious." Emulus snorted, his lips curling into a sneer. "Victorious? Ha! We will not merely emerge victorious, Marcus, we will triumph! We will crush the Carthaginians beneath our heels, and Hannibal will be brought to his knees, begging for mercy." His words were laced with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and Furius's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing the young tribune like a dagger. Marcellus shook his head, his expression grim. "You would do well to remember, Lucius, that Hannibal is not a man to be underestimated. He is a master of war, a general without equal. We will not defeat him easily, and we must be prepared to face the consequences of our actions." His voice was like a cold wind, cutting through the warmth of the tavern and sending a shiver down the spines of the men around him. Furius nodded, his face set in a determined expression. "Marcellus speaks the truth, Lucius. We must be cautious. We must be prepared. The fate of Rome hangs in the balance, and we are the only ones who can save her." He paused, his eyes locking onto Emulus, his gaze burning with intensity. "We will not be swayed by pride or ambition. We will not be deterred by fear or doubt. We will stand, we will fight, and we will emerge victorious, or we will die trying." As the candle burned low, casting eerie shadows on the walls, the men fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. The air was heavy with tension, the weight of the impending battle hanging over them like the sword of Damocles. They knew that the fate of Rome hung in the balance, and that the coming days would bring forth a reckoning unlike any other. In the distance, the sound of drums echoed through the night, a haunting melody that seemed to carry on the wind, a reminder that the enemy was closing in and that the time for talk was drawing to a close. The men rose, their faces set, their hearts steeled for the trials that lay ahead. For in the world of war there was no room for doubt, only the cold, harsh reality of victory or defeat. And as they stepped out into the cool night air, the stars twinkling above like diamonds scattered across the velvet expanse, they knew that their destiny awaited them on the blood-soaked plains of Cannae. "Let us go," Furius said, his voice low and commanding. "We have a war to win and a city to save." The men nodded, their faces set, and together they walked out into the night, the darkness swallowing them whole, like a living, breathing entity. As they disappeared into the shadows, the tavern keeper looked up, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of curiosity and fear. "May the gods be with them," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. "For they will need all the help they can get if they are to survive the coming storm." The candle on the table flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, as if the very spirits of the dead were watching, waiting to see what the future held for the men who had just walked out into the night, towards the abyss of war. The night air was thick with tension as Furius, Emulus, and Marcellus made their way through the winding streets of Capua, their footsteps echoing off the stone buildings. The city was alive with activity, the sound of hammers ringing out from the blacksmiths' forges, the smell of freshly baked bread wafting from the ovens, and the murmur of hushed conversations from the crowds of people gathered in the streets. The men moved swiftly, their eyes scanning the shadows, ever vigilant for any sign of danger. As they walked, they discussed their plan of action, their voices low and urgent. Furius, ever the pragmatist, advocated for a cautious approach, one that would allow them to gather intelligence on Hannibal's army before engaging them in battle. Emulus, on the other hand, was all for a bold, decisive strike, one that would catch the Carthaginians off guard and give the Romans the upper hand. Marcellus, meanwhile, remained silent, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his mind working overtime to anticipate the challenges that lay ahead. Their destination was the villa of the Roman consul, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a man renowned for his wisdom and strategic mind. As they approached the villa, they could see that it was surrounded by a high wall, guarded by a contingent of Roman soldiers. The men were stopped at the gate, their identities verified before being allowed to pass. Inside the villa, they found the consul pacing back and forth in the atrium, his face etched with worry. He was a tall, imposing figure, with a strong jaw and piercing blue eyes that seemed to bore into the souls of those around him. His hair was graying, and his eyes were sunken, but his spirit remained unbroken, his determination to defend Rome burning brighter than ever. "Ah, Furius, Emulus, Marcellus," he said, his voice firm and commanding. "I see you've arrived. I trust you've heard the news?" He paused, his eyes scanning the room, as if searching for any sign of weakness or doubt. Furius nodded, his face grim. "We've heard, sir. Hannibal's army is gathering near Cannae, and we must act quickly to stop him." He paused, his eyes locking onto the consul. "But we need a plan, sir. We can't just rush in blindly without a strategy." The consul nodded, his eyes narrowing. "I agree. We need to be cautious, to use our heads as well as our swords, but we also can't afford to wait too long. Hannibal won't hesitate to strike, and if we're not prepared, we'll be caught off guard." He paused, his voice taking on a note of urgency. "I've called a meeting with the other consuls to discuss our plan of action. I want you all to be there, to provide your input and expertise." Emulus spoke up, his voice eager. "Sir, I think we should strike now, while we still have the element of surprise. We can't let Hannibal dictate the terms of the battle. We must take the initiative and show him the power of Rome." His words were laced with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and Furius's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing the young tribune like a dagger. Marcellus shook his head, his expression grim. "I disagree, sir. We can't afford to rush in without a plan. Hannibal is a cunning enemy, and he'll be prepared for us. We need to use our intelligence to outmaneuver him and catch him off guard." His voice was like a cold wind, cutting through the warmth of the villa and sending a shiver down the spines of the men around him. The consul nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I agree with Marcellus. We need to be cautious, to use our heads as well as our swords. But we also can't afford to wait too long. Hannibal won't hesitate to strike, and if we're not prepared, we'll be caught off guard." He paused, his voice taking on a note of determination. "I'll call the meeting for tomorrow, at dawn. Be there and be prepared to fight." As the men left the villa, they couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. The stakes were high, the consequences of failure too terrible to contemplate. They knew that the coming battle would be fierce, that the fate of Rome hung in the balance, and that they were the only ones who could save her. As they walked, they were joined by a young, inexperienced soldier named Gaius Terentius. He was a fresh-faced recruit, eager to prove himself in battle, and Furius took him under his wing, teaching him the ways of war and the importance of discipline and loyalty. "Remember, Gaius," Furius said, his voice low and serious. "In battle, there's no room for doubt or fear. You must trust in yourself and in your comrades. We're a team, a unit, and together we can overcome any obstacle." He paused, his eyes locking onto the young soldier. "But you must also be prepared to face the worst. War is brutal and unforgiving. You'll see things that will haunt your dreams, and you'll be forced to make choices that will test your courage and your character." Gaius nodded, his eyes wide with excitement and fear. He knew that he was in for the fight of his life, and he was determined to prove himself, to make a name for himself, and to bring honor to his family. As they approached the city gate, they were met by a group of Roman soldiers who were busy preparing for battle. The men were armed to the teeth, their armor polished, and their swords sharpened. They were a formidable sight, and Furius felt a surge of pride and confidence. These were the men who would stand with him, who would fight alongside him, and who would defend Rome to the death. But as they left the city and made their way towards the gathering army, Furius couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that had been growing inside him. He knew that the coming battle would be fierce, that the stakes were high, and that the consequences of failure were too terrible to contemplate. He knew that Hannibal was a cunning enemy, and that he would stop at nothing to achieve victory. The fate of Rome hung in the balance, and Furius knew that he and his men were the only ones who could save her. He steeled himself for the battle ahead, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing with thoughts of strategy and tactics. He knew that the coming days would be the most challenging of his life. But he was ready. He was ready to face Hannibal, to face the Carthaginians, and to defend Rome to the death. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape, Furius and his men arrived at the Roman camp, a sprawling city of tents and soldiers that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air was thick with the smell of cooking meat, and the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. Furius felt a sense of pride and belonging, knowing that he was part of this vast and powerful army, an army that would soon clash with the forces of Hannibal in a battle that would decide the fate of Rome. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He knew that many of these men would not survive the coming battle, that many would fall, and that the survivors would be forever changed by the experience. He knew that the road ahead would be long and hard, that the challenges would be many, and that the stakes would be higher than ever before. And yet, despite the doubts and fears that gnawed at his heart, Furius felt a sense of determination and resolve. He knew that he and his men would face the coming battle with courage and honor, that they would fight to the death to defend Rome, and that they would emerge victorious, no matter the cost. The fate of Rome hung in the balance, and Furius was ready to do whatever it took to save her. The sun beat down upon the Roman camp, casting a golden glow over the sea of tents and soldiers. The air was thick with tension, the sound of clanging steel and the murmur of hushed conversations filling the air. Furius, Emulus, and Marcellus stood outside the consul's tent, their faces set with determination. The consul, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, emerged from his tent, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Gentlemen, the time for preparation is over. Tomorrow we face Hannibal and his army on the plains of Cannae. We must be ready, for the fate of Rome hangs in the balance." Furius nodded, his mind racing with the strategy they had devised. "We will deploy our infantry in a triple line, with the hastati in the front, the principes in the center, and the triarii in the rear. Our cavalry will be positioned on the flanks, ready to strike at the enemy's weak points. Emulus's eyes gleamed with excitement. "And I will lead the charge, with my legion at the forefront of the battle. We will break through the Carthaginian lines and shatter their army." Marcellus's expression was grim. "We must be cautious, Emulus. Hannibal is a cunning enemy, and he will not be easily defeated. We must be prepared for any eventuality." The consul nodded, his face set in a determined expression. "We will do what is necessary to emerge victorious. We will fight with every ounce of strength we possess, and we will not yield. For Rome, we will triumph or die." As the sun began to set, the Roman army began to prepare for the coming battle. The soldiers sharpened their swords, checked their armor, and said their prayers to the gods. The air was thick with anticipation, the sense of foreboding hanging over the camp like a dark cloud. Furius walked among the soldiers, his eyes scanning the faces of the men he would lead into battle. He saw the fear and uncertainty in their eyes, but he also saw the determination and courage. He knew that they would fight with every ounce of strength they possessed, and that they would not yield. As the night wore on, the Roman army settled in for the long wait ahead. The stars twinkled above, casting a silver glow over the landscape. The sound of crickets and rustling leaves filled the air, and the soldiers tried to rest, their minds racing with thoughts of the coming battle. But Furius could not sleep. He stood outside his tent, his eyes scanning the horizon, his mind racing with thoughts of the coming battle. He knew that the stakes were high, that the fate of Rome hung in the balance. He knew that the battle would be fierce, that the Carthaginians would not yield easily. And yet, he felt a sense of calm, a sense of determination. He knew that he and his men would fight with every ounce of strength they possessed, and that they would not yield. For Rome, they would triumph or die. As the night wore on, the darkness seemed to grow thicker, the shadows deepening and lengthening. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and sending the trees creaking. The Roman army stirred, their senses on high alert, their hearts pounding in their chests. And then, on the horizon, a faint light appeared. It grew brighter, illuminating the landscape, and Furius's heart skipped a beat. The Carthaginian army had arrived, and the battle was about to begin. The Roman army stirred, their armor clanking, their swords at the ready. Furius drew his sword, its blade glinting in the moonlight. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest, and let out a mighty roar. "For Rome!" he shouted, his voice echoing across the landscape. The Roman army responded, their voices rising in a thunderous chant. "For Rome! For Rome! For Rome!" The Carthaginian army answered, their voices rising in a fierce cry. "For Carthage! For Hannibal! For victory!" The two armies faced each other, their eyes locked, their hearts pounding in their chests. The air was thick with tension, the sense of foreboding hanging over the landscape like a dark cloud. Furius stood at the forefront of the Roman army, his sword held high. He gazed out at the Carthaginian lines, his eyes locked on the figure of Hannibal, who stood at the center of the enemy army. Hannibal's eyes met Furius's, and for a moment the two men stared at each other, their wills locked in a fierce struggle. The air was thick with tension, the sense of anticipation hanging over the landscape like a dark cloud. And then, in a moment of perfect silence, the two armies stood frozen, their eyes locked, their hearts pounding in their chests. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the battle to begin. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow over the landscape. The stars twinkled above, like diamonds scattered across the velvet expanse. The wind whispered through the trees, its soft rustling the only sound in the stillness. Furius and Hannibal stood frozen, their eyes locked, their wills locked in a fierce struggle. The fate of Rome and Carthage hung in the balance, and the outcome of the battle was far from certain. And in that moment, the two armies stood ready, their hearts pounding in their chests, their wills locked in a fierce struggle. The battle was about to begin, and only one side could emerge victorious. The silence was palpable, the tension building to a crescendo. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the battle to begin. And then, in a moment of perfect stillness, the two armies stood frozen, their eyes locked, their hearts pounding in their chests. The fate of Rome and Carthage hung in the balance, and the outcome of the battle was far from certain. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the battle was about to begin. The question was, who would emerge victorious? Only time would tell. The sun rose over the plains of Cannae, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The air was thick with tension, the sound of clashing steel and the scent of blood and sweat hanging over the battlefield. The Roman army, led by Furius, Emulus, and Marcellus, stood ready to face the Carthaginian army, led by Hannibal. The battle began with a fierce charge by the Roman cavalry, who clashed with the Carthaginian horsemen in a flurry of hooves and steel. The Roman infantry followed close behind, their swords and shields at the ready. The Carthaginian army, however, was not easily broken. They held their ground, their phalanx formation impenetrable to the Roman attacks. Furius, Emulus, and Marcellus fought bravely, their swords slicing through the Carthaginian lines. But Hannibal's army was too strong, too well trained. They pushed back against the Roman advance, their numbers and discipline slowly but surely gaining the upper hand. As the battle raged on, the Roman army began to falter. Their lines were broken, their soldiers scattered and disorganized. Furius, Emulus, and Marcellus fought on, but they were vastly outnumbered. They were surrounded, their backs to the wall, and their swords were beginning to tire. Hannibal, meanwhile, was everywhere on the battlefield. He rode his horse, his eyes scanning the landscape, his sword slicing through the Roman lines. He was a force of nature, unstoppable and unrelenting. His army was his instrument, and he wielded it with precision and skill. As the day wore on, the Roman army was slowly but surely pushed back. Their soldiers were falling, their bodies strewn across the battlefield. Furius, Emulus, and Marcellus fought on, but they were the last remnants of a once proud army. In the end, it was just Furius who stood alone, his sword raised high, his eyes locked on Hannibal. The Carthaginian general rode towards him, his eyes blazing with triumph. Furius knew that he was beaten, that the battle was lost, but he refused to yield. With a fierce cry, Furius charged at Hannibal, his sword flashing in the sunlight. Hannibal met him, their blades clashing in a flurry of steel. The two men fought on, their swords ringing out, their bodies locked in a fierce struggle. But in the end, it was Hannibal who emerged victorious. With a vicious blow, he struck Furius down, his sword slicing through the Roman's armor and into his heart. Furius fell to the ground, his eyes locked on Hannibal, his body still and lifeless. Hannibal stood over him, his chest heaving with exertion, his eyes blazing with triumph. He had won the battle, he had won the war. The Roman army was defeated, their soldiers scattered and broken. The Carthaginian army, meanwhile, was victorious, their numbers and discipline proving too much for the Romans to handle. As the sun set over the plains of Cannae, Hannibal stood victorious, his army at his feet. He had achieved the impossible, he had defeated the Romans and won the war. The fate of Rome was sealed, their army defeated, their people subjugated. The Battle of Cannae was over, and Hannibal had emerged victorious. The Roman army was no more, their soldiers either dead or scattered. The Carthaginian army, meanwhile, was triumphant, their victory complete and utter. And as Hannibal stood on the battlefield, his eyes scanning the landscape, he knew that he had achieved greatness. He had won the war, he had defeated the Romans, and he had secured his place in history, and his name would be remembered for eternity. The Battle of Cannae was a disaster for the Romans, a catastrophe that would be remembered for centuries to come. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the battlefield, Hannibal surveyed the carnage before him. The Roman army was defeated, their soldiers either dead or fled. The Carthaginian army, on the other hand, was triumphant, their victory complete and utter. Hannibal's eyes fell upon the body of Furius, the Roman general who had led the charge against him. He felt a pang of respect for his fallen enemy, a man who had fought bravely and with honor. But he also felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had emerged victorious and that his army had proven itself to be the superior force. As the night wore on, Hannibal gave orders for his army to tend to the wounded and to bury the dead. He also gave orders for the Roman prisoners to be taken into custody, to be held for ransom, or to be sold into slavery. The Carthaginian army worked through the night, tending to their wounded and burying their dead. They also worked to secure the battlefield, to ensure that the Romans would not be able to regroup and launch a counterattack. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Hannibal called a meeting with his generals. They gathered around him, their faces weary but triumphant. "My friends," Hannibal said, his voice filled with emotion, "we have achieved a great victory today. We have defeated the Roman army and we have won the war. But our work is not yet done. We must still secure the Italian peninsula and ensure that the Romans do not regroup and launch a counterattack." His generals nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. They knew that the war was far from over and that they still had much work to do. The meeting with his generals was brief, and soon Hannibal was riding through the battlefield, surveying the damage and giving orders to his soldiers. He was a man on a mission, driven by a desire to secure the Italian peninsula and to ensure that the Romans would not be able to regroup and launch a counterattack. As he rode, he came across a group of Roman prisoners, huddled together in fear. Hannibal looked at them with a mixture of contempt and pity. They were the defeated, the losers in a war that they had started. He gave orders for them to be taken away, to be held for ransom, or to be sold into slavery. The Romans would pay dearly for their defeat, and Hannibal would make sure of it. The day wore on, and Hannibal continued to give orders and to survey the battlefield. He was a man in control, a man who had achieved his goal and was now working to secure the fruits of his victory. And as the sun began to set on the battlefield, Hannibal looked out over the carnage and felt a sense of pride and satisfaction. The Battle of Cannae was a turning point in history, a moment when the course of the war was changed forever. And Hannibal, the great Carthaginian general, was the man who had made it happen. He would go on to secure the Italian peninsula, to ensure that the Romans would not be able to regroup and launch a counterattack. And he would return to Carthage, hailed as a hero and a great military leader. But for now, he could bask in the glory of his victory, knowing that he had achieved something truly great. He had won the war, and he had proven himself to be one of the greatest generals of all time. The Battle of Cannae was a turning point in the Second Punic War, a war that would go on to last for another 14 years. Hannibal's victory on the plains of Cannae was a crushing blow to the Roman Republic, one that would take them years to recover from. In the aftermath of the battle, Hannibal's army continued to march through Italy, conquering city after city and spreading terror throughout the land. The Romans, reeling from their defeat, struggled to regroup and launch a counterattack. But despite their best efforts, they were unable to defeat Hannibal's army. The Carthaginian general continued to win battle after battle, his reputation as a brilliant military strategist growing with each victory. Eventually, the Romans were forced to call upon the services of a new general, one who would prove to be Hannibal's equal. His name was Scipio Africanus, and he would go on to lead the Romans to victory in the war. But the Battle of Cannae would always be remembered as a turning point in the war, a moment when the course of history was changed forever. It was a reminder of the power of brilliant military strategy and the importance of adapting to changing circumstances on the battlefield. For Hannibal, the victory at Cannae was the highlight of his career. He would go on to win many more battles, but none would be as sweet as the one he had won on the plains of Cannae. As for Furius, the Roman general who had led the charge against Hannibal, his legacy would live on. He would be remembered as a brave and honorable soldier, one who had fought to the end to defend his city and his people. The Battle of Cannae was a reminder that war is a brutal and unforgiving business, one that leaves deep scars on the soldiers who fight it and the civilians who are caught in the crossfire. But it was also a testament to the bravery and sacrifice of the soldiers who fought in it, men like Furius and Hannibal, who were willing to risk everything to achieve victory.